These are devotions for people at a social distance. This morning in my devotions, I was reading in 1 Samuel chapter 18. And that chapter begins with an account of a really extraordinary relationship between Jonathan and David. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe he was wearing and gave it to David and his armor and even his sword and his bow and his belt. David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him. As a result, Saul sent him over the army, and all the people, even the servants of Saul, approved. Now, I know that this is a passage and others connected to it that has become a bit of a topic of discussion in some places these days. There are some people who like to typify David and Jonathan's relationship as a same-sex relationship, that is to say, a sexual relationship, and that this covenant is kind of like same-sex marriage. I don't necessarily buy into that whole thinking, not because I have any problem with it, or not because I necessarily think that the Bible would have had a problem with it, but because I think it represents probably an anachronistic cultural misunderstanding, and what is being described here is actually kind of typical warrior culture in the world at that time. But there is something really significant going on here that I never really connected until I was reading it today. And that connects it to a passage a little bit earlier in the book of 1 Samuel. And earlier on in 1 Samuel, there's a really interesting passage where it says basically that the Philistines at that time had a monopoly on the forging and making of metal weapons, and that they would not let Israelites have any of them. And that little description earlier on in this book ends by saying that basically there were only two people in the entire kingdom of Israel who had metal arms and armor, and they were King Saul and his son Jonathan. And Jonathan, up until this point in the story, has been this great hero who has used his weapons to win enormous victories. What we see here now is Jonathan taking these very rare things, his arm and armor, and passing them on because presumably he recognizes the potential that is there in David. And he, despite having been this great hero, despite shining among the nation, he is willing to let somebody else shine, let somebody else live out, their destiny and be their very best person, and to outshine Jonathan. And of course, that's what goes on to happen. And that is really something kind of extraordinary. How often do we see people who shine, who are extraordinary, and yet when they see somebody else come along who has enormous potential, often our reaction, of course, is to be jealous and say, let's keep that person down. But Jonathan here does the opposite, and he says, here's somebody who potentially can outshine me. You know what? I'm going to let him do it. And he gives David those arms and armor, which allows him to train and actually use these things, and he shines for the sake of the kingdom. So this is really just a moment when we think of the wider kingdom rather than yourself, what is good for all the people rather than what is good for me. A kind of extraordinary moment. And how often do we shy away from those moments? How often we see somebody and we see their potential, and our temptation is to just keep them down and say, no, you're not allowed to get ahead of me, even if that would bring good for other people. So let's celebrate Jonathan, a really extraordinary man and an extraordinary moment. And this is his most heroic. Lord our God, when we see people who have the chance to shine, let us not keep them down. Let us just let that happen. Let us do what we can to let them shine and to reach their full potential. Amen.